influences with those things, yeah? Anything else from last time that sticks in your mind? Bearing in mind that it was sort of just a part, and we're going to do another part of it today, so I guess particularly after today, Brendan and I need a fair bit of feedback from you about, because that's sort of the soils part of this, this program that we're doing. So we've allowed 2 days to try and give a quick overview of all the soils type stuff. So I guess particularly after today, when we've sort of tried to cover as much as we can on the soils, and other days, we can do bits and pieces, but the focus then changes a little bit. So particularly after today, but anything else? Any questions from last time that sort of been driving you crazy for a few weeks, sort of thinking that just didn't make sense to me?
No, I wasn't
more sense.
Sorry?
I said it made more sense once you explained it.
I was intrigued with the importance of organic matter,
Yeah.
So these soil structures and whatnot. So,
yeah. Right. I was looking, couldn't find these till afterwards all the time, but that's just a few dung beetles for those that aren't familiar with them. That's just one that I had made up years ago. Just as a curiosity, so just pass that around and I'll get it back off you later. But just the different sizes. They're some of the ones that were common in when we did some work down around Dundalk years ago. So today the focus sort of is very much on soil nutrients, soil chemistry, and some basic understanding of those things, with an aim, I guess. Brendan will talk later on about the soil tests. They've all been sent out, Brendan, have they? People have got those
copies there.
Yeah. So some of you, I think you've got 40-something soil test results now that Brendan's worked through trying to collate and so forth. So this morning I wanted to sort of try and have a bit of background about soil nutrients, the phosphorus and the sulphur and some of those things, and just some real basics about how they work and things that we need to think about, with an aim that sort of later on, probably after lunch, we'll go look at your test results and start talking about what fertilisers you might do and how, and some of those things. So hopefully a little bit of background helps when we're making those fertiliser and money decisions about what we're going to spend, what things are worth doing and what aren't. We won't get to fully cover that, because sort of then we've got to integrate it with our pasture types and our grazing management and all that sort of stuff as the picture builds. But that's where we're heading for today. Grow plants, grow pasture to feed cattle. That's our ultimate goal with it. So, basic requirements for plant growth: sunshine. The whole job was driven by photosynthesis, and that's sunshine with a bit of carbon dioxide and water floating around there, and plants doing that magic job of turning that sunshine and carbon dioxide basically into glucose and then into carbohydrate, which the animals then eat, except that the world goes round. If we look at the bit of bush, bit of natural system before we get involved, we've got some nutrients. So the big picture is sort of that sunshine and all that carbon and things cycling around, but to get that happening, we've got some nutrients, our nitrogen, and nitrogen's mostly in protein, and our calcium, which is in bones, and all that sort of stuff's floating around, and those things are just cycling around, around the paddock. If nothing's being removed, hopefully it just cycles around, whether that's highly productive or less productive, but it sort of gets an equilibrium and balance going there of what's happening with those nutrients. We start mucking things up because we go selling cattle or selling hay or selling milk or potatoes or whatever it might be, and taking nutrients off the paddock, and we replace them by bringing in, the obvious one is bringing in fertiliser, but anyone bought in hay or grain or pellets or anything like that, every time you bring feed in, you're also bringing nutrients into the farm. I think we might have mentioned with, a little bit with like hay, the amount of hay that you take off of it, nutrients goes off a paddock with hay, but equally every time a truckload of hay comes in, you're bringing in nitrogen and phosphorus and potassium and all those things are coming in. So when we do a nutrient balance on some of the dairy farms, probably half the nutrients coming off the farm is in bought in feed, not fertiliser. So it just depends on the detail and the situation. But so that's what we're sort of trying to keep in mind. So when we're looking at what fertiliser type inputs we might need, what we're mostly focusing on is those soil test results. But in other situations, particularly some of the dairy farms, it's more a nutrient budget. So on one hand, you can look at what's there with the soil test, but if you're in a highly productive horticulture or say hay production or something, you might be looking, a lot of your fertiliser decisions will be made on that nutrient budget where you're working out what nutrients you're actually taking off the farm and trying to replace those. So you can use both methods that will help to inform those sort of decisions that we make. So just thinking about a 500 kilo beast that's there, just as a, and it'll vary slightly, but you're looking at about 11 kilos nitrogen. You're looking at 3.5 kilos of phosphorus, some sulphur, some potassium. And a lot of that's going to be in bones, and some of it will be in the rest of the animal. Of what's there, the nitrogen's obviously in the protein, so that's in the meat. In different parts of the animal, but every time an animal goes out the gate, so we think about Northern Australia where they just harvest animals, no fertiliser used, but it might take a long time, but eventually you do deplete the nutrients that are going there because they're going out the gate. It's just a matter of how fast that sort of thing might happen. Okay. Our law of the minimum that gets talked about, what's the thing that's most limiting our pasture growth? Water, obviously. And the next thing that's most limiting is also not on that little diagram. Usually for us with grasses, it'll be nitrogen. And then it'll be other things. But there are other environments where it'll be phosphorus quite commonly. And historically, I guess most of Australia is ancient rocks and all those sort of things that we hear about, and we know that naturally phosphorus is one of the things that's most limiting. They did some fertiliser trials down in the southern tablelands. Went for about 7 years, and in a mixed pasture, and they were getting no response to nitrogen at all. It was all phosphorus and sulphur. That were the most limiting things. So the point being, whatever's most limiting is going to set the bar, if you like. You get over that hurdle, then you go to the thing that's next most limiting, and that's the way we work with this. If you want to get the ultimate optimum sort of the genetic potential of your pasture to grow, you need to have no limitations. We fix everything up. That's a decision that you can make. It might be too expensive. You might say, well, that's great, I know what ultimate's going to be, but I can't afford it. Or I know what a perfect soil might be as far as the soil test is concerned, but hang on a minute, my soil is only this deep. And every second, 2 days after rain, I'm running out of moisture again. So with the best soil in the world, I'm not going to get particularly good pasture growth. So they're all things that we need to balance up. And it's fine to be getting soil test results, but you need to keep it in perspective of everything else. So when you're talking to Brendan or anyone else, it's to say, well, that my soil's only shallow, or it gets waterlogged, or there's other limitations that might come in. That's without getting into all the diseases and insects and things and weeds that we're trying to manage as well. So, as an example, I guess, of a soil test result, and they vary with the companies and the time and the layout, and you'll have some things coming back there. Obviously, you need to know when it was taken. The other thing that we're particularly interested in is that depth that it was taken. So for our pastures, the standard depth that we'll take a soil test is 0 to 10 centimetres, so the top 10 centimetres. And remembering, particularly if most of the time we're not cultivating, so any fertiliser we put out or any manure that goes out goes on the surface. So the tops, that's where most of your nutrients tend to build up. Some of them will leach and move through the soil relatively easy, others don't, and we'll touch on those as we go through. But that depth is particularly important when we're trying to compare to some of these standard or target levels that you see in a soil test. It'll say, your phosphorus level should be whatever number it might be, but that's overriding at a certain depth. So if you were selling your property and the price had anything to do with soil fertility, and you want to, and someone said, I want a soil test on that, on your place to see if the ground's any good, because I'm going to pay you more money. If it is, it's worth more money to me. If it's good. Then the first thing I'd try and do would be take shallow soil tests, okay? Because the nutrients are concentrated in the top. So if I was to do 0 to 7.5, that would come up with a higher number than 0 to 10. They're only indicators of what's going on. Vice versa, if I go 0 to 15, or include some subsoil, that's going to dilute. It'll dilute as you go down. Most of the nutrients get less as you go down into the soil. So that depth is quite important when you go taking those samples. The next thing that we'll look at, you can see here we've got pH, and we'll go through all these a bit more as we go through. This is just a quick overview. So you can see here we've got pH in water, pH in calcium chloride. I think we talked about that down the paddock last time a little bit. So from our soil test from the lab, pH in calcium chloride is the one that we focus on because it fluctuates through the year less than the pH in water. If it didn't, so it's more consistent and reliable in that regard. So that's the one that we tend to focus on. Our organic carbon, how much organic matter's in the soil, that's useful as well, not just for carbon trading or any of this stuff that Polly's talk about, and most of our pastures, and we'll have a look when we go through all your results, but some of them are quite high, some are low. 2.9, that's typical of a pretty average sort of grazing pasture. So that's organic carbon that gets tested. There's a fudge factor, I think from memory it's about times 1.7 is for the amount of organic matter that's in the soil. So organic matter and organic carbon are directly related, but the numbers are slightly different. So in your soil test, it's carbon that they actually measure. We talk about organic matter, but it's soil carbon that we measure. It's just we have to, when we're calculating how much organic matter is in the soil, we do a correction factor. What's we've got? So with our soil pH, the next thing that my eye does anyway is jump straight down and look at how much aluminium's in the soil. Reason for that, and I'll show you some pictures later on of what aluminium does to roots, but basically it's toxic to plants. So most of our soils are loaded with a lot of aluminium and iron, and as your pH drops, which means your soil gets more acidic, those things become soluble and become active in the soil. At higher pH, they're just inert in the soil, they're not causing any problems. But aluminium is one of the things that gets up and is toxic, and it's not actually the pH that's the acidity in your pH that's stopping plant growth, it's usually the aluminium toxicity. It can also be manganese toxicity, but it's not usually tested because it's a really tricky one, because it's affected not by moisture and temperature and all sorts of things, not just pH. So most of the time we'll be focusing on aluminium, and most of the things that we're growing have evolved in an environment like this, in acid soils and so forth, and they're reasonably tolerant of aluminium. Whereas if you wanted to grow something like lucerne, it's highly susceptible. Okay, so lucerne's one of the most sensitive things to aluminiums, which means that it's one of the things that if you're going to grow lucerne, you probably need to lime, which raises your pH, which then gets rid of this aluminium toxicity out of your soil. If that sort of makes sense, but we'll go through that a little bit more as we go through it. Our phosphorus, the system that we're using is a coal phosphorus test and a phosphorus buffer index. We use both of them. So the buffer index doesn't change. That's basically indicated by whether it's a sandy soil or a clay type soil and the type of soil that it is. And that we then use that to set our targets for what the coal level might be. There's about half a dozen, depending on what lab you use, there's about half a dozen different phosphorus tests that are available commonly, and they all operate on different scales and all have different things. So the background with that is the main reason that we use coal is it's the one that historically we've got the most data on. It's the one that it's got problems. If you go back to when I was a pup, Department of Agriculture used to offer free soil tests to everyone. And the test they used was called a Bray test. And that was the one that we had a lot of information on. Then years ago they decided government should get out of that sort of thing and should privatise it. And the main people doing soil tests then was the Incitec fertiliser company called AFL back in the day. Some of you may have come across those sort of things. And AFL did the coal phosphorus test. So that was why it's become the one that's most commonly used. Most of the trial results were done using that. And that's the one we've got the most information on. There's a range of other tests that different labs use. The trouble with them is that they might be popular in the US or something, but we don't have good information on them here. So basically you're relying on and some of them are good in alkaline soils rather than acid soil. That was why they like Bray was simple and really effective in acid soil. This one's trickier, and that's why we need to use the buffer index.
Is there a conversion for coal oil to Bray too?
Not reliably. Okay, you can get a correlation sort of, but you're better off to stick with one or the other. The reason, according to the soil chemists of the day, Bray was the most reliable in our environment. The reason that Incitec didn't do it was twofold. It uses some pretty nasty reagents, so there's some OHS problems with it in the lab that Incitec didn't like. And the other reason was what they do with the coal thing is some of it is in the reaction time. And Incitec was set up that they'd get all their soil tests in, they'd set them up this afternoon, they'd put them in a beaker with all the reagents, and they'd shake them overnight for 16 hours. And then tomorrow morning when they came back to work, they were all ready to do the results. And that was as much the reason for doing it, was just practical sort of, material management type stuff within the lab, rather than that it was a particularly good test or anything. There's just some reasons like that, as I understand it. Don't worry about that. What we're using is coal wool. If you're using another test, so the important message out of that, with any lab results you get, you need to know, is it a pH in calcium chloride? You need to know, is it a coal wool test? If it just tells you phosphorus and a number, then you might as well throw 2 bob in the air. You need to know what methods that they're using. And most of the major labs will be using the same standard sort of testing procedures. When we get to sulphur, we've got there, it says KCl40, that's a test method. There's an MCP on, there's another one that the Victorians commonly will use. There's a different, we're using coal wool. If you get see results out of Victoria and New Zealand, they'll use an Olsen test, which is similar, but instead of shaking for 16 hours, they only shake for half an hour. So the numbers are always much lower because they've pulled out less of the phosphorus out of the soil. Cation exchange capacity. So the cations are all of these things: potassium, calcium, magnesium, aluminium, sodium. So hopefully we've not got much aluminium, and hopefully we've not got much sodium, because animals need sodium as a nutrient, plants don't. Okay, so sodium in the soil is somewhat of a problem, which we will get to. But so if you add all of these things up, you get to this cation exchange capacity. It's just simple, add them up, and that gives you the total. Couple of things that does: the higher that number is, usually it indicates there's more clay in the soil. And it's a general sort of overview indicator. But it's not something that you're going to spend money on changing. You just say, that's what it is. It's a bit like day and night. There's not much that you can practically do to change it with what's going on. What have I done here? We'll come to it later, but calcium-magnesium ratio, again, is just the ratio of calcium to magnesium. That's focused on by some people as being a major indicator. But when you look at all of the trial results over time, it's not, again, to me, it's not something you'd spend money on changing. You're aware of it. It might influence your decision whether you're going to use lime or dolomite if you have to change pH. And some people get really hung up on it. But we've done trials with cropping type areas where they've gone from a calcium-magnesium ratio of 1 to 1 to 1 to 50, and it's made no difference to the result, the production results. So but we'll come back to all of that sort of stuff. So they're the main things we're looking at. And then for us, we'll also be interested particularly in potassium. Some areas potassium's just never deficient. Yeah, they don't even bother testing it in the soil. For us, it does vary, so it's one of the other things that we want to try and monitor. So pH is an overview thing, and then we'll make a decision whether we need lime using aluminium. Phosphorus, we use both tests, and that's one of our major fertiliser requirements often, so we'll make fertiliser decisions on that. Carbon, we're probably not going to spend money to change carbon, unless they make it worth our while, which is unlikely. Lots of reasons that we touched on why we want organic matter in the soil, but we're not going to spend money just to put organic matter in the soil. Sulphur is a nutrient that quite often is deficient and limiting what we get. Remember our law of the minimum? It's sulphur, it's phosphorus and it's potassium are probably the three that we focus on with our soil test. Nitrogen, we just assume that it's going to be deficient unless it's a legume paddock or you've loaded it up with a heap of nitrogen fertiliser. You know, usually you go out in a paddock, if you were to put some urea out there, it'd turn green and grow more. You just got to make the choice, is that cost effective? Do I need the extra feed in the next month or two? Am I going to get it because moisture and temperature and so forth are suitable for the pasture type that's growing there? And have I got the stock to use that extra feed? So it's more of a short-term type thing, and it's a bit like moisture. We can get some sort of input. Yeah, we can measure it. We try and be as precise as we can if it's a significant input. But a lot of the time we can just look out there and we sort of say that's just the way life is. It's dry. It's nitrogen efficient. That's just normal. Or not.
Neil, did I understand it correct that nitrogen and the risk of over-applications got a big impact on your pH?
Yeah, can we come back to that?
Sure.
Okay, we'll try and run through that, but yes, exactly right, in the longer term. Okay, not some, you know, we can drive pH down pretty quickly with misuse of nitrogen, but if we use it properly, and what we're trying to do is minimise that effect, but it's one of the main drivers of that drop in pH, and that's why I think we said last time that everything we do to try and increase production is going to drop our pH, because it involves having more nitrogen in the system. Yeah.
Just back, sorry, did you mention what electrical conductivity means? I just want to know what that means.
Oh, okay. Yep. Electrical conductivity is what we use to measure salinity. Okay, so that's the test they do in the lab. So it's just a conductivity meter that sees whether the current will pass out of the meter. It's a bit like checking your wires on the house or something, if there's electrical conductivity there. And basically that's the more salt in the water, the higher the electrical conductivity will be. So yeah, we'll come back to that one a little bit more in later on as well. But that's what that's used for. So hopefully, I think there were, Brendan, one or two of them that had where that snuck up a bit. Usually it's not going to be an issue, but in some areas that can be really significant. For us, usually it's not in this sort of area, but you know, there's parts of the hunter that you'll get salinity. It's interesting that you know, salinity was in the news all the time there a few years back, but it's dropped off. And we'll touch on it a bit as we go through, but basically in dry times your water table drops and salt comes up. In wet times the water table comes up, and that if you're in an area that's got salt in the soil deep, it brings the salt up, and that's when we start hearing about salinity. So if we have a run of wet years, apart from flooding, we might start to get, you know, that's where the salinity thing comes into that discussion as well. That some areas, obviously, salinity is a major issue, and that might be the first thing you look at in a soil test.
Yeah, is there a chart that shows the optimum one for this area, or what your reading should be?
We'll have that. Brendan's working on a little handout that will tell you some of that. I'll show you some numbers, and there'll be you haven't got that handout?
Yeah, I'll hand that out now.
Oh, if you like, yeah. So there's a summary of a lot of what we're talking about in a few pages there. Okay, so just to focus a bit on soil pH acidity and a little bit on the carbon and so forth, we'll run through. So again, they're just some test results. I might flick over that and think about, go back to step one, pH, and I think we touched on pH scale goes from 0, extremely acidic, to 14, extremely alkaline. 7 is neutral. Most of our soils are going to be in this sort of 4 to 6.5 range. Occasionally you'll get 7. Anything above about 8 is a problem when you go the other way in alkaline soils. So you go out to Gunnedah or something, and it tends to be that in wet environments you tend to have acid soils, in drier environments you tend to have alkaline soils. So, and not only is the pH interesting of itself, but it has a huge influence on how some nutrients, other nutrients react. So if you're starting to look for, say, a zinc deficiency, you expect that on alkaline soil, not on acid soil, because of that pH affects how much of it is soluble and available. The ones that we're most interested in, because we're usually in this acid soil situation, the two things that are most affected by pH will be phosphorus availability and molybdenum. So we don't normally test molybdenum in soils. That's been done enough times to know that if we've got acid soil, we just assume we're going to be molybdenum deficient, and we need to be able to manage that as a trace element situation. The other one is the lower your pH is, the more likely phosphorus is to react in the soil and get tied up. And we'll get to that as we go through. Important things like beer's got a little bit of tang to it, and that's a little bit acid. If you, as a summary type thing, if you look at pH and aluminium, why we one of our targets with pH in a calcium chloride test is to say that once we get over about 5 or 5.2, or depending on what your numbers you're looking at, we don't need to use lime. Part of the reason, or a large part of the reason for that, is that once you get at that level, you've got no aluminium. Remember that we were talking about aluminium being toxic to plants, and as your pH drops, there's a strong correlation there with more and more aluminium in the soil. Now that's also influenced by your geology. So the sort of, at a pH of say 4.5 here, we might have, and those sort of numbers are ballpark, 4.5 you might have 10% aluminium. If you go to somewhere like Rylstone, you might have 30% aluminium at that level because of the different rock background, how prone that is. Then you start to then look at what that means. We start to think, well, if we're trying to grow lucerne, 2% aluminium is going to be toxic, so it's highly susceptible. A lot of the things that we would like to grow, clovers and ryegrass, probably coming in, and there's numbers in some of the handout type things, but yeah, you're probably in this 10 to 15% aluminium starts to knock them around. Your kikuyu and paspalum and the like, they're up here at about 20-25% aluminium, so they're just naturally more tolerant. So if you flip that, on one hand we're thinking which pasture species need lime. If you flip that question around and say which ones are going to give you a return on investment, if I go and get a load of lime in and spend 10 grand and get it spread everywhere, am I going to see extra growth, and is that going to be profitable for me? Well, if I'm growing kikuyu, chances of getting extra growth from lime are not great. It's great for my soil. If you've ever got a tax problem and want to just sort of put some money away somewhere, lime's great. In our environment, it'll never do you any harm. But whether you're actually going to see a benefit or a financial benefit out of it, we read so many things. It's good for your soil biology, it's good for phosphorus efficiency and all sorts of things. But it also depends on what you're growing as to whether you're actually going to see more production from using it. And that makes the decision to use lime really hard. We said earlier that everything we do to increase production is going to drop our pH. And we know that if we let it drop far enough, those aluminium levels will become, as the pH goes down, aluminium goes up, becomes toxic to plants. And then we get to a situation ultimately where we can't grow anything. So, but it's like the frog in hot water. It's a decision you can always put off, but if you always put it off, you're going to get yourself into a huge problem. So at some point we want to be able to put lime on a paddock, but it becomes as much of a budgetary question as an agronomic question. Agronomically, lime's always good. The question mark becomes, is it going to be profitable or not? The thing with that they do is in those cations they also test hydrogen, so they're talking about cations the same, but their numbers are completely different, and they've got and they tend to really focus on that calcium magnesium ratio, and they focus a lot more on the cations than what I guess I'm talking about at the moment. That's just, but again, beware if you're using some of those different labs, there's a bit of different logic behind what's going on.
Just going back to when you talk about lime and lime not being all that beneficial for coaching and normal grasses.
Yeah.
But when you put lime on there, doesn't it stimulate the clovers and the clovers put nitrogen on it, make better grasses?
That's how and why you would like to do it. Yep. Yeah. Look, years ago, AMP had a big property down near Tea Gardens. Some of you might have been aware of that. It's all pretty much broken up, still pretty big blocks, some of it. But and they had a lot of Soteria and a lot of Kikuyu, not much clover, and they decided they wanted to try and get more clover growing in the Kikuyu. And they put something like 1,000 tonnes of lime on one year, mostly on the kike. I think some of it might have gone on Soteria as well, and they didn't see any extra clover. So it was, you can work out what 1,000 tonnes of lime was going to cost them for not much benefit. The theory was sort of good. It starts to get a bit, that comes into things like grazing management, other nutrients. There's a whole heap of other questions, and I'm not familiar enough with the detail of what their situation was, but I suspect part of the reason that they didn't get more clover was a difficult environment, but also their grazing management may well have influenced whether they could get clover or not.
That was all that peakly, floppy country.
Yeah.
But it used to look beautiful.
Sorry?
It used to look beautiful when AMP had it, and then...
Well, because they were loading super on it. Yeah, that correctly identified super, but it's just some really tough country to work on that. And one of the, they dealt with their phosphorus issues using superphosphate. I suspect that was probably low in potash, and I don't know whether they ever put potash on. And then they sort of looked at this lime issue, and sort of, again, it was sort of one thing at a time. And yes, we're dealing with the most limiting factor, but it'll only take you to the next hurdle, if you like. So, and that may well have been a situation. Most of the people, and there's some people down there that will manage some of that old country, and they've put things like chook manure and stuff on, and they've turned it around pretty well, but at a cost. Most would say, okay, we would love to be able to run two cows to the hectare, but reality is we're going to run one cow to 5 hectares on that country, and that's just sort of, that's the way the economics roll at the time. So that's when we talk about pH and lime questions, aluminium is one of the major parts of that sort of decision when we're deciding whether we need to be using lime. So our organic carbon, which is what we measure, organic matter is what we have in the soil, and yeah, it was 1.7. So if we want to convert if we're doing a carbon budget in the soil, they'll talk about tons of organic matter or tons of carbon in our soil. Now, with again, you need to be careful of depth. Some of those calculations are done on 30 centimetres, not 10, and some of them might go down to 70. So we need to know what depth we're talking about, and then we measure the carbon times 1.7, and then you can calculate out whether it's carbon or organic matter that you're building up in your soil. You can do that's just again simple maths when you know what the maths are to be done. Influences ability to hold nutrients, and the two that we're particularly concerned about when we say hold nutrients in the organic matter, carbon doesn't just sit in organic matter on its own. And one of the challenges I have with some of this talk about building up soil carbon to save the world and take all the carbon out of the atmosphere, etc., is that in organic matter, it's a pretty fixed ratio between carbon, nitrogen, sulphur, and you've also got phosphorus and things in there as well. And when they talked some time back about, they were going to pay $25 a tonne to build up carbon in the soil. The trouble was that barely covered the phosphorus and sulphur and nitrogen that you would need to put on to balance that because the carbon just doesn't sit there on its own. So the way we measure that is if you go out to the way that influences us is if you go out to a paddock that's got a lot of straw and the like in it. Okay, for that straw to break down into organic matter in the soil, it needs nitrogen to feed the bugs, a bit like a compost heap. You talk about carbon-nitrogen ratios, the same sort of thing is happening. If a lot of stubble goes in, it'll be high in carbon, low in nitrogen, and it influences the amount of nitrogen then available for plant growth. But they're being released. Equally, if you've got good organic matter in the soil, if you get a dry time, that organic matter starts to break down and that releases nitrogen back out for plant growth. So often you'll find, not so much in our environment, but if you go into the drier cropping areas, that after a dry time, they don't need to put nitrogen fertiliser on because it's been released. It's called mineralisation. And it's one of the things we're doing a fair bit of work with some of the dairies at the moment because they're looking at a higher level of production usually. But and for a long time, people knew that we didn't it didn't need to go putting a lot of nitrogen on kikuyu in the summertime often. Where they've got the dairies where they oversow with ryegrass in the wintertime and then they've got kikuyu in the summer, that's pretty common. And they put we fertilise and do all the sorts of things on the ryegrass. In the summertime, the kikuyu sort of looks after itself. Because usually that's our better growing season and we've got plenty of feed. But also in the hot weather, you get breakdown of organic matter. This is called mineralisation, which releases nitrogen. And that's just part of... Nitrogen's can be quite tricky. If you want to be really precise about it, it's tricky to measure, it's tricky to manage. Think back to your soil test results. It'll measure it'll give you a number for nitrate. That's the nitrate, not the total nitrogen. So part of where... I know this is getting a bit confusing, but another part of this carbon and organic matter is that it influences how we manage our nitrogen. Just leave it at that for the time being. Okay, if you can drive yourself mad trying to think how everything influences everything else. And I think we're sort of getting a bit too far in that. Organic matter also contributes to that cation exchange capacity. We said before cation exchange, cations being calcium, magnesium, potassium, sodium and aluminium. They're our cations we're most interested in. Okay, and they reflect whether it's a sand, that number would be low. If it's a clay, it's high. If you've got organic matter in the soil, that will also increase your cation exchange. If you've got a sandy soil and you can build up your organic matter in there, which means build up your carbon, then that can help increase your cation exchange, which means the soil is more fertile. It holds nutrients. So that organic matter holds some of those nutrients, which is particularly important in a more sandy type soil. I think we just touched on enough of those sorts of things. Okay, some of our nutrients. Let's see how confusing we can get here. Okay, so we've got our major nutrients are our nitrogen, we've said phosphorus, potassium, sulphur. They're the ones that usually we're looking at as, for most of our fertilisers. Our calcium and magnesium depends on our soil. And how do you put calcium on a paddock? Lime. Okay, lime is calcium carbonate. It's the carbonate part that deals with the acidity, not the calcium. Okay, calcium doesn't change acidity. It's the carbonate that reduces your acid soil problems. The calcium contributes to your cation exchange capacity and that fertiliser type thing. So, any of you grow oranges or tomatoes?
Next door.
Some there. Okay, and if you've grown them and you get that blossom end drop, you know when you get that dead spot on the bottom of the fruit? That's a calcium deficiency usually. So you put lime on, but in that case it's the calcium, not the carbonate necessarily. But be it as it may. Then we've got our micronutrients. So these things we're talking about, if we're putting nitrogen on, we're talking about tens of kilos per hectare per application, which might be hundreds of kilos per hectare per year of nitrogen that we're putting on in a highly productive paddock. Phosphorus, again, tens of kilos. It might be 10 kilos, it might be 50 kilos of phosphorus that we need to put on. Over here with our micronutrients, molybdenum, which is the one that we need most in an acid soil. How much molybdenum would we put on typically?
About 70 grams every 5 years.
Yep. Okay. So that's why they're micro. Zinc, it might be a kilo or two. Again, so very small amounts have a huge impact where they work. That's why they're called trace elements, micronutrients, whatever you want to call them. But and these things generally don't show up easily or well in a soil test. If we were seriously trying to test for those, we would do a tissue test or a leaf analysis, actually see what the plant has taken up to identify if we have deficiency or in some cases toxicity with those sorts of things. So that's the one that we're looking at most. In some areas it'll be zinc, copper, sometimes boron, the manganese and sodium. Sodium can probably go over here because it's a sort of a major cation type thing as well. But we're more concerned about toxicity than deficiency usually with those. And sodium is not toxic it is toxic to the plant, but it also has that effect on soil structure. That's where you would need gypsum. So, thinking about phosphorus, major nutrient deficiency in most soils. Where I come from in the Hunter, we just assume it's not, and if I see a soil test that's got adequate phosphorus in it, it's one of two things. It's either on some alluvial soils that were naturally highly fertile anyway, because the soils where that sediment came from originally was different and highly fertile, or it's had a long, big fertiliser history going on where people have built up over time. They've put a whole heap in of phosphorus. Needed for plant growth with what's there. If you're highly phosphorus deficient, often you just don't get any growth. But if you or it'll be stunted. The plants will be stunted, and they can have a bit of a bluey look about them. But often it's just that it's just not growing, and it's not growing well. It's limiting what's going on. As we said, coal wool is the most common phosphorus test method that we're using, and that PBI, which is phosphorus buffer index, that's used to interpret the coal wool. So if we go putting fertiliser on, we'll change that number. The coal wool number will, we hope to build up over time usually. The PBI doesn't change, so you don't really need to test that regularly. Once you know the PBI for a paddock, it's really not going to change in any practical time frame. And they've suggested a common range is 5 to 80. Well, I think we've got a few that are a bit more than 80. Brendan, haven't we? And as you go around, if you get, it's not that uncommon that you would get around here that you would get a coal wool test in the hundreds. Do you know where they're going to be? It's going to be on a dairy farm where their effluent goes out and the manure has built up the phosphorus level in the soil. But and in that situation, you can put on all the phosphorus you like, you're not going to get any more growth because it's no longer deficient, it's just excess going on there. So the sorts of numbers that we're looking at, so with our PBI, just to sort of ballpark that, so in this we're saying that very low, so for sandy soil, PBI will be 70 or less, and sometimes it's down into the teens sort of thing in a real sandy soil. And in that case, we're looking at a coal wool level of 25. So basically a sandy soil, it's easy to build the levels up, but they drop down quickly. They fluctuate very, very quickly. As you go down, most of our soils are going to be loam or clay loam in this sort of range. And if you get up into some red clays, Comboyne or something, if you've got Dorigo, those red soils, then they can have very high PBIs, which means that your coal level needs to be more. And basically that red colour, we talked last time about the red colour in soil being iron. Iron reacts with phosphorus and takes it out of solution and makes it inert. And sometimes I've seen some of the and that's one of the benefits of liming, that doesn't happen so much, because you know, remember we said as your pH goes up, aluminium and iron are less soluble. There's less of it there in that chemical soup that's going on. So but one of the things that happens as your pH goes down, you've got more iron and aluminium. They react very quickly with phosphorus and they bind it up. And despite some of the lime company promotion saying, oh, you can put lime on and release that phosphorus, we don't live long enough for that to happen. Okay, it's sort of, for practical purposes, once it's tied up, you're not going to get it back. What the lime will do will stop the next lot of phosphorus you put on the paddock being tied up like the last lot was. It's not going to put lime on it, you don't suddenly get this big flush of all this phosphorus getting released, unfortunately. We'd love it if it did, but it ain't going to happen. Okay, but it will stop the next lot getting tied up.
I'm going to put some phosphorus in my paddocks to increase it. It's in PBI 210. I've been thinking the other day that from school chemistry, I remember that some chemicals tend to bind with other chemicals. I'm thinking, if I put it there, will it bind with someone else and disappear? And then I have to do it again, and maybe I should put someone else to neutralize those chemicals, or is it like a road to nowhere?
You can't stop that happening. It doesn't just sit there sort of loose in them. It's going to get used by something. It'll hopefully get used by plants and get cycled. Okay, plants eat it, plants use it, animals eat it, animals excrete it back out, goes back into the soil, and plants use it again. That's the ideal world that we'd like to live in. One of the things that you can do is, if your pH is low, you can put lime on. That makes it more efficient, but you don't want to be putting lime on at the same time, because you don't want the calcium. In alkaline soils, we'd be talking about calcium tying up phosphorus, the same as it can affect nitrogen and things as well. So if you're putting lime on, you don't want to be putting nitrogen or phosphorus or other fertilisers on until the calcium's had time to react in the soil. So we're probably, warm weather, moist soil, a couple of months or something would be more than adequate. It might only be a few weeks in some cases. So you don't want to go putting lime plus other fertiliser in direct contact. As long as they're not in direct contact, then you should be okay.
So pretty much there's nothing you can do if the lime or calcium level is okay, then there's nothing you can do, you just put phosphorus.
Historically, in cropping it, in our pasture situation, I guess the logic I use looking at how we use fertilisers is a wee bit different to what we'd use in like a wheat cropping situation or something, where you put fertilisers on now, you harvest your crop, you've either made money or you haven't. It's more short term. With what we're doing, it's sort of more constant flow, and sort of things are cycling around, and what we don't use this week we might use next month, sort of thing. Sometimes, but the approach in a wheat cropping situation used to be that it was cheaper to put an extra 10% phosphorus on. Know our soils are acid, know they're going to tie up the phosphorus. It was cheaper to put extra phosphorus on than to have to go out and lime the paddock. That sort of changed, and that worked very effectively for a number of years until their pH got down to the point where it was starting to mean, hey, we can't grow wheat or whatever anymore, and we've got to grow more tolerant plants. So eventually, if you don't put that lime on, eventually, and it might be 50 years or more, eventually you get to the point where you just can't grow the crop you can do. So as a short-term thing, you just say, okay, I'm going to put extra phosphorus on. I know it's not efficient, but it's cheaper than having to go out and put lime, but long term we need to use the lime.
Okay, well, if lime is okay, then, if level of calcium is okay, then it's just a matter of putting more phosphorus in that case.
Yep. Okay, flick over to our sulphur. Historically we didn't really focus much on sulphur because we were focusing on phosphorus. We used superphosphate fertiliser And superphosphate fertiliser just happens to have about 11% sulphur in it. Then two things happened. Some years back, there was an effective, and go back sort of really early, we didn't have a lab test that could measure the sulphur for us. So we were just unknowingly overcoming any sulphur problems. Two things happened probably 20 odd years ago. First of all, that KCL40 test was developed so that we could reliably measure sulphur levels in our soil. The other thing happened that some more concentrated fertilisers became available. Any of you use DAP or MAP, those sorts of things? Urea and all that. So they don't have sulphur in them. So, when we only had the choice of superphosphate, we automatically fixed the sulphur problem. When we started doing our, being really clever and doing our sums and saying, hang on a minute, DAP is more cost effective than using super, and started using DAP, we were no longer automatically putting that sulphur on. So we start seeing, so now we see sulphur deficiency is more common on the coast than what we were led to believe years ago. They used to always say, sulphur deficiency is important at Scone or Gunnedah, where they had soils that were naturally high in phosphorus, so they weren't using super, and that was, and they were getting a response to something like gypsum, which has sulphur in it. So they were the areas where we focused on sulphur, not these sort of coastal and tablelands type areas where the sulphur was just automatically being fixed up because we were using single superphosphate. So now sulphur is like any other nutrient. If we need it, we need it. If we don't, well, we can delay that investment at times. So
When it's leached, where does it go? I mean, I'm asking the question because I've had a massive rate of sulphur in 1 year when we had to put on gypsum, 1.5 tonnes of gypsum. So that's 255 kilos per hectare of sulphur.
Yep.
But between the soil tests the year before and the following year, there wasn't a huge increase in sulphur. So what happens to the massive overload of sulphur that just seemed to disappear?
Well, it can, so back a step. Sulphur, when we're using it as fertilisers, it comes in two forms. One is sulphate, which is the water-soluble form, which is in gypsum, and that's immediately available. Or you can use elemental sulphur, which was called flowers of sulphur. That's that yellow stuff. It's can be quite acidic, okay, but for plants to use it, it's got to be in that water-soluble sulphate form. So if you put the elemental sulphur on, the yellow stuff, okay, bugs in the soil have to work on that to change it into sulphate so the plants can then use it. It's a slow release type thing. Also, elemental sulphur is highly acidifying on your soil. So that's one of the things, if you wanted to make your soil acid, you put elemental sulphur on it and it'll really knock your pH down. So that means when you do your budget, elemental sulphur is good, but we've got a budget that, hey, we're going to have to use lime more frequently if we were to go that way. Your question, bottom line, I don't know, but yes, so sulphate does leach, but it also gets tied up in organic matter. Okay, so it's a bit like nitrogen. When you try and do a nitrogen budget, you need to allow for any mineral build-up of organic matter in the soil.
Yep.
So nitrogen and sulphur are the two main things that are being built up in that soil. So if you burn a crop, the two things that go off most, or if you compost, if they go off to the atmosphere, are nitrogen and sulphur. So they make doing that nutrient budget harder.
Yeah.
Okay, so the sorts of levels we're looking at, with our sulphur, anything above 8 in a beef grazing situation, above 8 should be okay. If we're in a dairy or an irrigated situation, we'd probably like that to be 10. And as you get below 6, below 4, you're grossly deficient. You'll see it. If you look at what that's going to look like in a paddock, it can be not that, it's easy to see in a corn plant. Corn's beautiful for this one. If you've got a nitrogen deficiency, your paddock goes yellow, yeah? You've seen that, and you've seen where the urine patches are, and it's big and green, and the other bits are light green, yellow, depending on how studded they are. Any of you grown corn, sweet corn or anything at home? Okay, instead of all the leaves being like that, the leaves come up and up and up. So your old leaves are down the bottom, and often later when the crop's up, those old leaves will go yellow and they die off first. that's nitrogen deficiency, because what the plant does is take the nitrogen out of those old leaves and put it up into the new growth. Sulphur is the opposite. It doesn't translocate, it doesn't get moved around. So with sulphur deficiency, it's the young new leaves that are yellow. It looks exactly the same because they're both in the protein. But with sulphur deficiency, it's the young new leaves that are yellow rather than the old leaves that occurs in nitrogen. Otherwise, they look very similar. So in a paddock situation with grass, because they're all clustered together, unless you get down sort of trying to work out which are the new leaves and which are the old leaves, they look similar if you get to that extreme. But again, it's that lowest, most limiting factor. Sometimes it can be sulphur. If that's what you've got, you can put all the nitrogen on you like. It's not going to respond because it needs sulphur. You've got to put on the thing that you need. Also, if you start getting extremely high levels locally, if you're in some of that low acid sulphate type country, sometimes that's the first way we identify that as that it's a problem, is that you get these sulphate levels of a couple of hundred, crazy off the scale type numbers, which means, hey, I better look further and try and explain that. There are other tests that they use for proper tests for acid sulphate, but if you're just doing a normal soil test, sometimes that's the first clue that you get that something's going crazy out there. Acid sulphate soils, do we need to talk about that? We touched on it a little bit last time. Any more questions on acid sulphate, or we'll flick over that for a moment? Potassium's the other one that I want to spend a little bit of time on. So potassium is one of those cations that we were talking about. Okay, and basically, if you go back to your high school chemistry, a cation has a plus on it when they have it's a potassium as an ion, as a floating around in the water solution. It's a K. K is for potassium with a plus on it. Okay, it's another one that we talk about more than other areas. So it comes back to your rock chemistry, whether you're likely to be in an area where you need potassium or not. And sometimes on the coast we'll have areas that are. So it's the sort of thing that can vary valley by valley quite commonly. I think some of your numbers were quite low and some of them were reasonably high. So it's just one of these things. There's a couple of different test methods. The one that we tend to use is in that cation test procedure, and it's this milliequivalence. That again, how they change terminology sometimes. Now the metric boffins, instead of calling it milliequivalents per 100 grams, you'll see on your test result, it's CMOL, centimoles, which is the term the chemists want to use at the moment, per 100 grams. The scale is exactly the same. So whether it's MEQ milliequivalents or CMOL, the 0.3 is 0.3. That much hasn't changed. Generally, for most of our soils, we'd like them to be sort of 0.4, 0.5. It's not, there's a big grey area, so if you're above 0.4, 0.5, you're okay. All you need to do is monitor. If you take, particularly in that, potassium's one that hay and silage takes lots off the paddock. So your hay and silage paddocks, that's one where you would monitor. If you're above 0.4, 0.5, you'd say, okay, I've got a bit up my sleeve. I don't have to put potash on now because it's expensive, but I need to monitor it. If you're below 0.3, you can say potassium is limiting my pasture growth. If you're in between sort of 0.3 and say 0.5, you're in a grey area. It might be limiting, it might not. Part of that question, it comes back to everything else that's going on in the soil, but part of it is it a legume? Because they're the things that often will respond to potash before grasses, and that's the grasses. We talked the other day, grasses have that fibrous root structure that really explores the soil and is really good at getting nutrients out of the soil, whereas your clovers and your lucerne and the like got a tap root and hasn't got the same root structure, so it's not as good at getting it out of the soil. And potassium, potash, is one of the things that where that is really noticeable. So often your potassium, it'll be your clovers that will show a response to fertiliser before the grasses.
Neil, I've also seen deficiencies in night day strip grazing paddocks with the transfer of the
Yep.
potassium very strongly from the day to the night
Yep.
paddock.
So potassium gets moved in urine, particularly more so than dung. So if you've got a strip grazing or the old, nearly every farm in the area that used to be a dairy farm started off with a day paddock, night paddock system, and over potassium was reacting in the soil, in the clay particles in the soil, was getting first dibs at it and binding it up. When they put 400 kilos of potassium on, bang, it was like hitting it with nitrogen. It just grew like crazy. Okay, that it can make, so sometimes you get it out and you say, I'm just going to try a bag or two. Some things that works with, it may not work with potassium. And I've certainly had experience with that down our way. The Williams Valley, which is Newcastle water supply, it's notorious for being low in potassium. And I've talked to people there, had exactly that conversation, and they've gone out and put a bag, it's expensive, we'll just put a bag out, nothing happened. That was a stupid thing to do, won't bother talking to that bloke again. But it can be a bit of a trap. So I guess, the answer to that, like any of these things, if you're trying something different, do some test strips. So, the way I would normally do a test strip, I'd think this is the rate that I think is right, and it wouldn't matter whether it's potassium or nitrogen or phosphorus or what it is. This is the area that I think is right. I'll put, most of the paddock's going to get that. I'll do a strip that gets a half rate, and I'll do another strip that gets a double rate. And just to see what happens. Then I can decide in future what I want to do. Now, sometimes I might do most of the paddock, and one of my strips might be no fertiliser, and sometimes I might just put some strips in the paddock and the rest of the paddock gets nothing. But that's, it gives you some clue and some confidence with what you might do next, trying to decide what's happening out there.
Just on potassium, I know quite a lot of farmers who manage their phosphorus pretty well. They put on reasonably high rates, so they're getting their potassium, they're getting their phosphorus and they're getting their sulphur. They'll lime every 10 years or so, they'll strip graze and silage cut and not replace potassium. They're still getting pretty good crops, but so how limiting really is potassium?
Hunter Valley was renowned for growing lucerne. Okay, and there's paddocks in the Hunter that have grown on some really nice soils. They've grown lucerne without potash for 70, 80 years. When you do the nutrient budget, and potash is pretty easy, you can work out that, okay, they're growing, round figures, say they're growing 15 tonnes of dry matter, which is about 18 tonnes of hay. That's about 6 cuts of hay a year going off those paddocks. If you look at potassium and you get that hay tested, as you would for a feed test, then it's about it can be about 2.5% potassium. So it's about 8 times. In most plants, it's about 8 times more potassium than phosphorus in them. So if you've got hay going off the paddock, that's what gets taken off. If you've got hay coming in the gate in the feed truck, that's what's coming on the farm. So you think of those. It's about 25 kilos of potassium per tonne of dry matter. Okay, we've taken 15 tonnes of dry matter. So what's that? 375 kilos of phosphorus, of potassium gone off the paddock in 1 year. If we were to replace that, that's about 700 kilos of muriate of potash. And so anyone that's bought that can do the sum, but it's not cheap. Okay, righto. So we've taken 375 kilos of potassium off the paddock in 1 year. We've been doing that for 70 years. How many kilos of potassium have we taken off the paddock? And we wonder now why, if you look at the lucerne in those paddocks, it's like this. Where once we might have been getting every cut, you might have been getting 1.5 tons, 2 tonnes of hay. Now you're lucky to get sort of a tonne on a good day. And you see all these leaves, and they've got all this, they've got this yellow all around the outside of the leaf, which is one of the classic symptoms of potassium deficiency. So that just shows how good those soils were originally, because they've been able to grow for 70 odd years without any fertiliser, but they've got to the point now where they might have started up with heaps, they've gradually mined it down to a point where it's affecting you. And if you can see deficiency symptoms like that yellowing, it's already cost you money. That's why we're using soil tests, because we want to know when we need to put that fertiliser on before it starts reducing our growth rates.
There's two types of potash though, isn't there?
Muriate of potash and sulphate of potash.
Yes.
Yep.
And I did a soil test with Ludwig T&N years ago, and he said not to put muriate of potash on. They put the other on.
Why?
Yes, I'll ask the question why.
That's build up chloride ions, and it's a question I've got.
Okay, so muriate is potassium chloride, sulphate is potassium sulphate. Muriate is 50% potassium, 50% chloride. Sulphate, I think it's about 40% potassium, and the rest is sulphate. Sulphate is a better fertiliser because it hasn't got chloride, it has got sulphur, which we may need as a fertiliser. It's a much nicer fertiliser for pretty much every agronomic reason you can think of. The only trouble is it's twice the price of the muriate. So depending on how tight your budget is, mostly we use muriate on pastures because it's cheaper. Most of the sulphate would go into horticulture where it's a less significant part of their cost structure. Nowadays, because we're seeing sulphur deficiencies, if you get a soil test and you need potassium and sulphur, then potassium sulphate ticks all those boxes, and you're just going to have to pay for it. So it'll be twice, getting on towards twice the price of the muriate.
What's the impact? Do we have an issue with long-term build-up of chloride in this high rainfall environment?
At the rate that so chloride can affect soil biology. A little bit of soil chemistry, you can get chloride toxicity. So if you get a water test done, one of the things that they'll test will be the chloride levels, because in irrigation and so forth, too much chloride can burn plants. Look, for practical purposes, we generally aren't putting enough on to cause a problem. Long term and theoretically, yes, it's not nice, but I guess because of that cost difference, we're just sucking it up and saying that's the one. We'd like to use the other one, but we're going to use muriate. Sorry?
Just a pool cleaner. I'm trying to climb the wall and it's sucking a bit of air.
So usually the usual one, because of cost, is going to be muriate. Yeah. But if you've got a sulphur deficiency, then and I guess it's a case of if you don't have a sulphur deficiency, and we'll try and go through some costing things later on. But if you cost the things that you need. If you don't need sulphur, then that extra money is sort of wasted in the short term. But if in the longer term, if you're running down, you're going to need sulphur, then you'll get some benefit out of it in time. But no question that sulphate is the preferred, more user-friendly type fertiliser, but it's expensive. And it's as simple as that. It's simple. It's muriate because of cost. Interestingly, when you talk about some of the organic type things, they're right down on muriate, but they're all mined out of old salt pans in Canada. So they're just instead of sodium chloride is normal table salt, potassium chloride is a salt. It's just it's got potassium instead of sodium. And and often it's old, from what I understand, having not been there, but they just mine it like salt out of old salt pans in Canada, and in a different part of the lake where it was deposited, you might have sulphate. So it's not a manufactured product; it's just mined and turned into and you look at it, it's just a pinky-looking salt. And there's some stuff in, I think it's WA, where they're looking to try and mine some in Australia. Don't know, we haven't heard any updates on that recently, but it was pretty exciting when someone announced that they were going to do it. But so they use those things obviously in industry and manufacturing and industrial chemistry type stuff. It's a feedstock for that sort of thing, but we're using it for using it as a fertiliser as well. But they're both just mined. They're not. Neither of them are manufactured in a factory. Where did we get to? So, thinking about our plant nutrients, our nitrogen, it's in proteins. The beauty of legumes is that they get nitrogen from the atmosphere, bacteria in their roots, the rhizobia bacteria that we're all familiar with, get nitrogen from the atmosphere and turn it into a form that the plant can use. You've got nitrogen from the legume, clover or whatever it might be. a little bit of that will ooze out of the roots and escape into the soil, and if the grass roots are in close contact, they'll have access to it. Most of it, but, is released when the cow eats the clover and then excretes urine and dung. That's how the nitrogen gets back onto the ground, and that's when the grass is going to use it through those patches. Or when the plant dies and decomposes, that also will release that nitrogen. You haven't just got a clover plant there pumping nitrogen out for the grass. It's got a cycle somehow or other. So that's how that one will work. Nitrogen leaches, so when we get wet weather, I think most have heard about nitrogen leaching out of a soil in wet weather, but you also lose it to gases, particularly in waterlogged soil. So it depends on how much is there. Most of our paddocks are going to be nitrogen deficient, so your losses aren't huge, but you get down on the flats and the dairy farms and so forth, where they're trying to keep those high levels of high protein pasture going, and we get waterlogged conditions, i.e. a flood. Then in those sort of conditions, a lot of nitrogen gets released as a gas, and that's why. So on a farm, if we're looking at global warming and all those sort of things, one of the things you get hit with is methane coming out of the front end of a cow. You know, it's burped, it's not fathered, most of it's burped up as methane, and that's what they do as part of that rumen digestion. So methane out of a cow. The other thing that we get hit with is nitrous oxide gases out of waterlogged soils. They're the two big contributors that we have on farm to that global warming type question. Phosphorus promotes growth. It's not leached, so it's almost the extreme opposite of nitrogen. So nitrogen works really quickly. Okay, so you use it or you lose it. So you put nitrogen fertiliser on, like urea or something, the plant uses it, and you've got adequate moisture, actively growing plants, within a month, 2 months, they use it for growth, or your chances are you're going to lose it. It'll be leached or it'll be lost as gas. Okay, it's not, you can be in a dry environment, you can build it up over time, but particularly in our wetter environment, we tend to, it doesn't hang around for too long in an available form. Part of the reason that it leaches easily is that it's got again, without going too much into the chemistry, clay particles have a negative charge on them. Opposites attract, so negatives attract positives. So your cations are positives. So they get held on the clay particles. Nitrogen as nitrate is a negative, so it doesn't get held by the clay and it just leaches out. Phosphorus is a positive. Okay, so phosphate, it's not phosphorus, you don't just have phosphorus floating around, it's phosphate, and it gets held by the clay. So you don't lose phosphorus by leaching. How you lose phosphorus on those red soils is it gets held by the clay and it's no longer available for plant growth. So it gets tied up in the soil rather than leached. So it's not getting lost out of the system, it is still there, but the plants can't use it if that happens, if that makes any sense. But that's, again, just background type stuff. In certain situations that will influence why you might put on a little bit regularly so that it's try and have it available for plant growth rather than a whole big dollop, and then it's going to get tied up in the soil and you lose it. So in those sorts of things. The sulphur, a bit like nitrogen, as we said, it's mostly in the organic matter. It's going to be. Potassium is a cation, so we start looking at ratios of potassium and magnesium, for example. So one of the things that, has anyone ever had grass tetany here? That's what I would have expected, and we hadn't had it in the hunter much either until we started saying, hey, we're low in potassium, we use potassium fertiliser, and potassium and magnesium apparently get taken up sort of in competition with each other, and grass tetany is a magnesium deficiency. We don't see it because often we've got adequate magnesium and low potassium. When we put the potassium up, and it's a bit of a balance, but the cows don't need as much potassium as the grass needs, so we can get excess potassium, and that creates a magnesium deficiency where we didn't see it before. In some of those areas where they've got plenty of potassium, so they don't need potassium fertiliser, but they often get grass tetany because they've got high potassium and low magnesium. So that balance thing becomes tricky as well. And molybdenum, as we said, is grams per year. I guess that only what, and generally we're talking sort of 50 odd grams of molybdenum, which usually came mixed in with your super, so it might be MO super. It was ordinary superphosphate with that bit of trace element molybdenum added to it, and you might put that on once every 5 years. How do you tweak that? If you've got more acid soil, you might have to use more molybdenum more frequently, and if your pH is getting up over 6 and you're not sure, you might put MO on once just to be sure, and you probably never have to do it again. Okay, so where some people have said a little bit's good, more must be better, and if you go overdoing the molybdenum, you create imbalances with other things, particularly copper. You can create a copper deficiency. So if you're using MO super every year, you can then over time create a copper deficiency, where the copper and the molybdenum are competing, which is an animal problem rather than a plant problem. Okay, so again, we're looking for Goldilocks. We don't want too much, we don't want too little, we just want to be that sweet spot in the middle where we've got the right amount. That's what we're aiming for with all of these things. In some cases, they all cost us money. If we've got too much phosphorus or nitrogen in a paddock, what's the problem with that? Particularly with those two. Other nutrients less similar but less so. What's the problem if we've got too much nitrogen in a paddock?
It's going to acidify the soil, it's going to be leached and lost.
In both cases, it's a waste of money.
Yeah.
But yeah, too much nitrogen, greenhouse gas, too much nitrogen, we're more likely to release those gases to the air, and we're going to have that leaching, and it's that leaching of nitrate down through the soil that makes the soil more acid. It doesn't matter whether that nitrate came from grass decomposing, from manure, from any sort of fertiliser. The chemistry might be slightly different if we get into it, which means simply the soil bugs that break it down, but ultimately it gets in a nitrate form. That's the one that's water soluble and moves easily in water. When that gets leached out, that takes hydrogen ions with it, and that makes your soil acid. With phosphorus, the issue with excess phosphorus in the soil is not that it's a waste of money because we put too much on, so we're not getting any more growth out of it. But if we get erosion, it gets bound up to the clay, so it's not leaching. But if you get erosion, that carries that into the soil, and one of the into the water, and one of the problems there is blue-green algae. Okay, there's 3 things that contribute to blue-green algae in your water contamination: warm weather, still water, and phosphorus. Because phosphorus is the thing that's limiting its growth usually. We put phosphorus in, and if it's waterlogged, often that phosphorus gets released where it may not be readily available in the soil. So again, there's some environmental downside. Apart from the waste of money, there's some environmental downside in having excess nutrients in there. We want the right amount, not too much, not too little.
Neil, how do you unlock phosphorus if you have a high rate of phosphorus in there, if it's locked up in the soil?
That's the issue. You probably can't. Some people talk it up. Lime helps, but not going to do the whole job. Or get biological activity will help, but not going to do the job. Kill rust. What's kill rust made out of?
Phosphoric acid.
Phosphoric acid. Okay, you put so you get that iron phosphorus reaction. Phosphoric acid kill rust. It stops it, but it's inert, and that's what happens in the soil. The iron reacts with the phosphorus. It's inert. So in our lifetimes, it ain't going to become available again, no matter how we should wish it to be different.
So so you just wouldn't put phosphorus on if you had a high rate of phosphorus in your soil test?
Correct.
Is that what you're saying?
Yeah. You'd need to have some other strange reason for doing it. If you've got adequate phosphorus on, you don't need to put more phosphorus on. You're going to get no benefit, and you're potentially going to have environmental downside.
And how long does it take if you put X amount of phosphorus on for it to activate in the soil?
Historically, it's got a bit of so the nitrogen's really quick. Okay, days, weeks to be available, and it's only going to last for a little while. Historically, phosphorus, we put it on once a year. if we've got extremely acid or soil, or we're putting high rates on, we might put it on, split that and put it on twice a year, half now, half in 6 months type of thing. So you can do split applications if you want. I'll show you some sort of numbers on if we get time on that later. So it's you just put in a pasture in a cropping situation, you put it on when you plant your crop. In a pasture situation, you put it on when you can. How you lose phosphorus is in waterlogged soil. It's you got that chemical soup happening when the soil's wet, and that's when it will bind into those clays, and that's when you lose it. So there was some work done years ago in the tablelands where they found that if you're at a maintenance level, if you were grossly deficient in phosphorus, you put it on when you planted your paddock. If you weren't planting the paddock, there was no point putting it on because there was nothing to respond to it. But if you're at a maintenance situation where things were okay, but you knew you had to put a bit of phosphorus on every year, the best time to put it on in the tablelands, we're talking Bathurst type area, was after winter, because winter was when they got waterlogged. If they put it on after winter, then it was available for 9 months of the year until it got waterlogged again. But if they put it on in autumn, which is traditionally when it was done, then wintertime it got waterlogged, so it was really only readily available and most efficient for 3 months. So that timing, so if you know when your paddock's going to get waterlogged, I would avoid putting fertilisers on just before that. But so if you're that clever, you probably can make money a lot easier than farming. Yeah. Sorry, go on.
So you wouldn't put it on in the summertime here, like in the December, January, February, when we get a lot of rain?
Yeah, probably not as a maintenance thing. So if I'm thinking, when would I put it on now? Probably the thing that's going to need it most and respond most would be clover, if I'm trying to grow some clover in the paddock, and that's going to germinate in the autumn, so I'm back to sort of putting it on, top dressing the paddocks in the autumn, which is traditionally what we might do. Yeah, it might be on, the fertiliser company might put a special on in January, and I can save a few dollars because I know I'm going to use it, and it'll sit in the shed for 3 months, but I'll wait until my clover's trying to come away, which is generally later in, hopefully we've missed the worst of the wet weather, unless we've got a winter east coast low. But but the thing that's going to cost me more than anything is, it's a bit like the share market, doing nothing is the one thing that's guaranteed not to work, not to do any good. We might not always get it right, but if we do nothing, we're sure to get it wrong.
If your soil sample's down to 10 centimetres and you've got your phosphorus locked up, why can't you deep rip to mix the soil up a little bit?
Because it's locked up. It's not going to just putting it to the air is not going to work. And most of the phosphorus is in the topsoil. It's going to be on the top. So if we do a soil test at 50 centimetres in this area, just about guarantee there's no phosphorus down there. Yeah, that might be. We might need sort of 50 parts per million, and you might have 3. Is commonly what. So we talk about deep roots and getting soil out of the nutrients. Got to be down there. So things like magnesium and potassium might be down there, but phosphorus would very rarely, unless you're on a bit of really good river flat, which the whole thing works a bit differently. On a bit of really good river flat, you'd want to check. You might have some phosphorus down there because those sediments 1,000 years ago might have had some phosphorus in them. But most of our soils, once you get below the topsoil, there's virtually no phosphorus down there anyway. The main thing that you're going to get from the subsoil would be magnesium. And other things you want. Iron that you don't want, yeah. Talking about excess phosphorus, I know of one case only where, and it was a turf farm, where they put so much phosphorus on they created an iron deficiency. And that was one for the books. So agronomically, too much phosphorus, that's the only case where I've ever heard that it's caused a problem. But environmentally, it causes all sorts of issues. And what we want to do is do the right thing, be on top of that sort of stuff so it doesn't happen, so that the environmental regulators don't go telling us how and when we should use our fertiliser. Okay, very quickly, calcium-magnesium ratio, some people, some of these alternate testing methods sort of really focus on it. We're saying it's not something we're going to spend money to change. We look at it, we consider it, but you're not going to spend money to change it. The thing that we in some areas we're concerned about high sodium, which is your sodic soil, dispersing soil that we talked about last time. Problems there. It's animals need sodium, soils and plants don't. Gypsum is the treatment for it. Where we get caught but is where we get very high magnesium in those subsoils, we can have similar problems. It's not as bad as sodium causing dispersion, but it can cause some physical problems rather than soil as a soil nutrient, I guess. I don't think the sodium thing is a big issue here, but those things can occur, but it's more for us. Usually, it's more magnesium than sodium if it happens. So, don't think it's a big issue. We'll flick over electrical conductivity, which, as we mentioned this morning, was that what we use to test for salinity problems. The issue there is that it changes with your soil type. So if it's a sandy soil, clay soils will naturally have a higher conductivity. They're better able to carry that electric charge, but it's not causing a problem at that point. So interpreting those numbers, okay, where it depends on your soil texture, whether it's a sand or a clay, what target levels you're looking at, where you'd be concerned with that electrical conductivity / salinity. So there's some numbers there. Just looking at what we might look at as a summary of all of that. So with our pH and calcium chloride, if the pH is higher than 5.2, we've probably got no aluminium there, and the chances of getting a profitable response to lime are less. Okay, it's not just your pH, that lime choice. It also depends on what you're trying to grow and how sensitive that is. Mostly we're going to be in that 4.6 to 5.2 range, where it depends on the species, plant species, whether you might consider it or not. But we know in the back of our minds that long term our pH is probably dropping. So step one, we soil test to monitor that. But we know at some point in our lifetime we have to we probably need to put some lime on so that the next generation don't get it in a worse condition than what we got. If we're below about 4, 5, getting in the low 4s, remember how pH is a log scale, so it gets worse as it drops. It magnifies the problem. That's when it could be affecting plant growth. So more aluminium, harder to grow legumes particularly, and it depends on what type of grass we're growing in that. So those two, we see pH and then our right click straight to aluminium. Is it what the aluminium level's like, and that's what we use to make that lime decision. Phosphorus, if we're in that moderate PBI level for loamy type soils, then above 40 or 50, depending on our PBI, is probably adequate. So we put more, and their target, when they look at a target level, you do a trial, and you look at your growth, they put different rates on, they do look, see how much extra growth you get. And we start, if we graph it out, we've got no fertiliser and no growth. We put a little bit of fertiliser on and we get extra growth. Then we put more fertiliser on, extra growth, but it may not be as much, and eventually you find that you put extra growth on extra fertiliser on and you're getting no extra growth. The target level usually will be about 90% of optimum. But that's a choice you can tinker with a little bit. So if you're an irrigator and you're pretty sure moisture's going to be okay, and you're going to get the response out of it, you might push it up even higher. You might be going for 95% of maximum growth. But if you know that moisture is going, I've got shallow soils and it doesn't rain every second day and chances are moisture's going to be limiting, then you might come back down to 80% of potential as your target sort of level. But so when we're looking at these targets, that's how they, that's sort of part of the background, the thinking behind setting those target type levels. Sulphur, as we said, but we'd like it to be above 8, so we'd like everything to tick these boxes here. If we're in this range here, it's that grey area where maybe yes, maybe no. Long term, it's worthwhile, but it's, you know, we might make an economic decision to say we'll live with that for the time being. And if we're down here, then we're pretty much guaranteed of getting a growth response out of it. Electrical conductivity, for us, that's hopefully going to be not a decision maker. Carbon, we're not going to spend money to build up carbon. Hopefully sodium is just something we're interested in, and hopefully cation exchange capacity, again, we're not